Host, like I am, and good afternoon to those of you who are in other parts of the country. We are so pleased to have you join us today for the first of what we hope is many sessions. I'm Dr. Sangeeta Gupta, and I'd like to welcome you to our first session of our Holistic DEI Leadership Speaker Series. Mariah and I started our DEI partnership when we founded and launched the Diversity and Cross-Cultural Summit in Southern California back in 2007. Our goal for the conference was to create a community focused on diversity, equity, inclusion, and cultural competency, a community that would learn from each other and support each other. We created this community over a period of 5 years. We've been called back to this conversation and are partnering again to launch this speaker series to continue our goal, and we hope this time to build a coast-to-coast community. We both believe that respectful conversations are at the heart of addressing our current situation. It is with this thought that we carefully chose our first set of speakers. We believe that with their experience and their intentionality to this topic, they will add much to the conversation that we are having as a country. So I'd like to briefly introduce our speakers. Schwanda Barnett is a membership relations ambassador and chair of the Diversity Council for the Florida League of Cities. She also serves as the Florida League of Cities liaison to the Florida Black Caucus of local elected officials. Schwanda received her Juris Doctor from Georgetown University Law Center with a judicial clerkship, adjunct teaching at Georgetown Law, working with the DC government in program development, human resources management, and organizational development under her belt. Schwanda joined the Florida League of Cities University team in 2016, where she brought her experience in the DEI space to her work supporting local officials as well as internal stakeholders by designing and co-facilitating trainings on ethics and diversity. Our second speaker is Dr. Scott Payne. After more than 30 years in higher education, Dr. Payne joined the staff of the Florida League of Cities as the Director of the Leadership Development and Education. Scott's perspective on public service has been formed by both his academic career and his political activities, which included serving for 2 terms as a Tampa City councilman. He's the author of More Than Self, which was released in 2017, Rethinking Public Leadership for the 21st Century, and a regular column in Quality Cities magazine and a blog at drscottpayne.com. Scott and his wife, Carol, have 10 children, including 7 adopted children and 7 grandchildren, which, being the mother of twins, I have tremendous admiration for how you juggled all of that. Mariah and I both extend our welcome to both of you, and just a tremendous thank you for taking the time to speak with all of us today. So welcome.
Thank you.
Thank
Great
you.
to be.
Thank you for having us.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Mariah. I am the co-host with Sangeeta, and I'm the executive director at New Life Village, which is a Tampa residential community for children impacted by trauma in the foster care system. Our village has an on-site holistic therapeutic program that helps our children and their caregivers heal from both trauma and to thrive. Between the events of the last year and the correlation we see at the village with racial inequities and trauma, I am excited to get back into this needed conversation. As a nation and as a village, we need to talk and we need to heal. In the past, diversity, equity, and inclusion was a conversation we had at work about work. Yet all of those topics impact us at home, in conversations with our families, our neighbors, in our churches, and in our community. We need to learn how to address and embrace this conversation in all areas of our life. So we hope you like our different approach this year. I have a couple housekeeping notes to share with everybody. The first thing is the session is being recorded. Second, thank you so much for your patience with any logistical glitches. This is our first time doing this, so we appreciate your humor and your patience. The session will run about an hour of presentation, breakout sessions, and then there will be a half hour for question and answers and open dialogue at the end. Everyone will be muted until everyone will remain muted. And at the end, when we do the questions and answer sessions, please direct message Sangeeta with any questions you will have, and she will read them to the presenters. There are 3 breakouts, and Schwanda will provide more details to you, and Schwanda and Sangeeta will shortly. Thank you again for joining us.
So, Schwanda, do you have any tips or suggestions for the participants regarding the breakout rooms?
I do. So Scott, why don't we go ahead and start sharing our
Will do.
presentation? So it's important to us that every time we have a discussion about having difficult conversations or about DEI topics, that we create a safe space. So we want to start by saying that everyone's opinion, everyone's viewpoint is welcome. We have to leave space for people to say things that we don't necessarily agree with, and then we'll have our opportunity to respond. But we want to make sure that everyone knows that this is a safe space. So each time you enter into a breakout room, if all goes well today, you'll be in with different folks. So we want to make sure that you're introducing yourself to each person in the room before you speak. Each breakout room will only be about 5 minutes long. And so we want you to kind of monitor your airtime, make sure that you're leaving room for everyone to share that wants to share. And then we're going to ask that you just show a little generosity of spirit and kindness. So even like I said, when you hear things that may trigger you, or you hear things that may, not sit well with you, respect that that is another person's opinion and their viewpoint, and feel free to share how you feel as well. But the most important thing to do is to commit to staying engaged, because there will be times when you may feel uncomfortable, and you have to be okay with that and push past that discomfort to get to a place of understanding. But if you stay engaged and you stick with us for the entire session, then I guarantee that there'll be at least one nugget that you can take away that'll impact the way you interact with others in the future. Scott, did you want to add anything?
No, I think that's great. I'm just going to make one quick comment that our format is a little bit different, as it turned out, than Mariah originally described. So we will have these breakouts and an opportunity to hear from you. And at the very end, we will have questions, but we're probably going to use most of the 90 minutes to go back and forth between conversation amongst us and then your conversations and then your report outs.
I think most of us have had some difficulty when we're talking about diversity, equity, or inclusion. In your view, what is the driving force behind these difficulties?
So I just used the word trigger, Sangeeta, and I want to say that I think that it's amazing that as a country, as a world, we're kind of moving forward in our collective consciousness of understanding when we hear something that triggers us. We hear the word dog whistle. We've heard these terms that speak to those words or those phrases that are said to evoke a reaction out of folks. But I think that the work to be done is to be able to hear those things and not react right away. And so what happens is a lot of times we'll hear these triggering words. I'm going to throw out a few words now, and I know that I'm almost 100% that these words will be a trigger for at least one person in this room, or one of these words rather. So COVID, coronavirus, those words have become triggering. Wear a mask, that's become triggering. Donald Trump, Joe Biden, just the names of presidents have become trigger words for some people. Make America great again is a trigger phrase. Me too. If you remember a couple years ago when the hashtag
Right.
Me Too was a big movement, people would hear that phrase and it would trigger them one way or another. And so we know that there's this natural inclination that we all have to hear these words or these phrases and feel something. We feel discomfort, we feel defensiveness, we feel anger, and that's okay. Recognizing what we feel and why we feel it is a very necessary part of the work. But the next step is thinking before we act on how we feel about what we hear.
So, do you think that a trigger can ever help a conversation be more constructive?
This is like my little secret superpower. I actually use triggers to kind of drive points home for people when they're really struggling to understand something from other people's point of view. I will try to think of something that they can relate to, which sometimes is connected to a trigger word, and then I help them to understand the perspective of another. So, for instance, a couple years back, Scott and I were doing a training with a group that was pretty homogenous. It was all African American leaders in the room. And we were talking about sexual harassment and about how those in power can sometimes use their power to influence others in a way that's negative. And so we talked about the different levels of harassment, and you could kind of see this. This was right around the time of Me Too. You can kind of see people closing up and getting defensive and making excuses for why certain behaviors don't mean what we think they mean and that sort of thing. And then I realized that it was time to do a reset on the room. So I stopped and I said to the group, do you all realize that a lot of times when we're talking about racism in America, systemic racism, that we hear the same responses that we're hearing from you all regarding sexual harassment? And everybody stopped because racism was triggering to them. they could understand that. They could understand what it felt like to be in a workplace where they were being discriminated against because of race. So when we made that connection to women being discriminated against and men being discriminated against because of gender, all of a sudden that trigger made it make sense. And so I think that there are times when these words can be very effective in communicating a point, but you have to be strategic about it so that people don't get lost in being defensive. Does that make
Okay,
sense, Sangeeta?
it does. What would you say are some of your triggers?
Oh, I have a few. And it's funny, over the last year, I've been doing the work to really identify not only what my triggers are, but why. One of the words that's triggering to me, or the phrases, is affirmative action. Because historically, I have been navigating being the only Black person in white spaces for many years of my life. And there are a lot of times where I've heard that phrase thrown around, and without the statistics to back it up, folks that are using that term don't necessarily understand that only women that look like me, we're not the only ones that benefit from affirmative action or have benefited from affirmative action historically. So that's been a trigger for me. But I've learned that instead of reacting or getting angry, that what's necessary is to have the data, be able to share information that you have with others about words that may upset you so that they can understand that the information they have may be limited.
Okay. So what do we need to do with these triggers?
I think it's important to recognize them. That's the first step, because what we can't do is just walk around angry all the time. I mean, we're between social media and the general media every day, where everything's coming at us and we're hearing all kinds of things that can just make us feel angry constantly. And that's not healthy or effective. It doesn't help us to communicate with each other better. So the first step is recognizing why we have these reactions to the things we hear, and then thinking about the other point of view, thinking about how we can have a conversation that's constructive with someone else about our feelings and about why we feel the way we do, and really trying to get down to the facts. And getting down to the facts is something that's difficult to do these days, but that's something that Scott's going to talk about a little later. So the more facts that we have to back up our feelings, the more we're able to effectively communicate. Scott, did
Well,
you want to add anything to that?
I wanted to set up the first breakout. I want to get you involved in a conversation as quickly as possible. So what we're going to ask you to do is talk about triggers. And when Schwanda and I were planning this, one of the things we talked about was our different reactions to a particular trigger, the F-bomb. And some of us have grown up in an environment where that's just common language. I mean, it's part of the vocabulary. And then some of us, myself being one of those, I mean, I grew up in a household where no one ever swore, and where we found creative ways to not swear, but to sound like we were swearing as boys. My parents only had boys, pity them. So we all have these reactions to things and different reactions to things. So what we want to do is invite you to think about your triggers. So we're going to send you to breakouts in a moment. And here's what we're going to ask you to do. And we're going to try to put the central task in the chat for your individual breakout rooms once you're in there, but you can see what's going on. Before you go in the breakout room, take a moment now to jot down, what are some things that trigger me? What do I react to? Words and phrases. And then in the breakout, give each person in the room a chance to share a particular trigger and the way it affects you, and maybe a sense of why that affects you, just briefly. And then invite the others in the room. Do you all trigger on that? Do you trigger differently on that? Does it not have any effect on you? Just to hear the different experiences we have with triggers. And remember, this is not a conversation about whether or not we should be triggered by something. This is just an opportunity for us to have an experience of reflecting on what are the things that trigger each of us and how different those can be. So Mariah, if you're ready, we can send them to their rooms.
And remember, just take a moment to think about it before you share out.
Scott, can you hear me?
I can.
So, okay, it didn't send you guys to breakouts. That's good. Okay. Sister Lean, Sister Catherine, did you get a prompt to go to a breakout room? If so, you have to accept it.
And we have a group, room 2 only has 2 people in it.
Okay. Room
We
2.
can't move anybody else in there at this point, but just that's.
There's
kind of
There's
watchful.
only one person in it. And oh, I see 2.
That's right. These things, they're 2 people. They can talk to each other.
It was
Right.
showing me that you guys were all in rooms. So that's why I was okay. So next time I just ignored the fact that it's showing me that you guys are going
So
to
Natalie is still not joined a room.
Natalie's
supposed to be-
signed. Yeah, Natalie's signed in twice, and then Renice
Okay.
Gray just joined us. So I'm going to assign her to room 2.
Right.
Okay.
Good. And I'm going to jump in each of those rooms quickly and post the chat. I don't think it works to chat otherwise.
So I just need to be quicker on my feet next time to move to other rooms. I was
Yep.
caught up that it was showing me you guys were in rooms, but you didn't go. Okay.
Well, we can accept or not accept. So I
Mm-hmm.
just said not at this time or something. That's what I clicked on.
All right, I'll be back.
Okay. Natasha, Becky, Tika.
I think for my schedule next time, I have to make sure I don't take 2 days off before the next. It was my husband's birthday and our anniversary when we met, so we always combine those 2 things.
Aw.
So yeah, I can't believe, Mariah, it's like 19 years.
Well, happy anniversary of when you met and birthday.
Thank you.
It looks like the chat may have hit everybody. When I went
Okay.
into the group, we'll ask if they could see it. It's an easy assignment. So if they didn't, we'll jump back and forth. It's awkward to jump in the middle of their conversation.
Right.
So it looks like people are chatting and talking.
Well, at least the one I dropped in on. And when I did this, it did not distinguish the chat to a specific room. It said everyone. So
Okay.
looks like everyone.
Okay, how do
So
we put
Renice Gray has not joined. Did you say that she's not joining or?
Well, she joined the, hold on, I have Karen coming in now, hold on. She joined the Zoom, but I put her in the room, but she didn't accept the room. That's somebody from my work. She's probably
Okay.
multitasking.
Okay.
So I'll just put Karen in room 2.
Okay.
So let's see, room 1 has got 3 people active. Room 2, it looks
So
like.
does Karen know she needs to accept that invitation because she's still not in room 2?
No, Karen and Renice, if you guys can hear us, please accept the invitation.
Oh,
to
she just
chat
did.
room 2. Okay.
She just did.
Renice is with me, so I'm sure she's multitasking, as is Natalie. She's our property manager. I'm at
Right.
home, they're in the office.
Okay.
All
Well,
right,
that's
room,
perfect. Karen made room 2 have 3, so that's awesome.
Perfecto. Yep.
yeah,
Mhm.
room 3
Okay.
has 4, room 4 has 4. One of them is my husband, and I can hear him in the other room participating. I'm very proud of him.
That's good.
Awesome.
Room 5 has 3 and room 6 has 3. Okay. Yeah, those 2 ladies that took a second, they're actually nuns that live at New Life Village. Sister
Oh,
Aline and Sister Catherine. Sister Catherine is like almost 90 years old. She's amazing. And we've got 2 sisters that are assigned to live at New Life Village and serve at New Life Village, which is really cool.
That's
that
very
is-
cool.
Yeah. And the majority of the kids at New Life Village, majority of the families are minorities. And so and most of my seniors, not all of them, but most of my seniors are Caucasian, and they've lived there and dedicated their retirement to mentoring these kids. And
that is so cool.
this
That
is
is
awesome
really
for
cool.
them to learn how not to be uncomfortable and have conversations and understand. Okay, time is up for 5 minutes. Do you want to close all break rooms now?
Yes, please.
All right, they got their 30 seconds.
Okay, welcome back as you're returning.
I know that feeling of, we was just about to say something. And zapped through hyperspace and into the main room. And some people are going to hang on to the last minute and get that last word in before they leave their group.
Scott, you might want to make an announcement. They have to make sure that they accept the groups, because a couple people weren't able to figure that one out.
Welcome back, everyone.
So I want to invite you to take a moment, if you can now, and share a trigger that was in your chat, something that your group discussed. Put it in the chat. Put that to Sangeeta, if you would, to Dr. Gupta. And if you have any questions coming out of this little conversation, you can post them there as well. We'll just take a look and see what sorts of triggers people talked about. Sangeeta, if you would, as you see some of these pop through, just share a few of the triggers that you saw.
Woke culture.
Oh yeah, that's a good one. That is a good one.
Okay, another one is truthful feelings disguised as a joke.
Mm-hmm.
Retard.
Mm-hmm.
For another one, it was wealth.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's all that's come through so far.
Good.
Those are good. Thank you so much for sharing, and thank you for sharing in your group.
Nike says being referred to as cold, and I can identify with that. That's triggered me. Say, no, I'm a passionate person. What are you talking about? I'm cold.
Okay, another one that's come through is African American.
Mm.
The whole conversation about how we want to be identified. That's another talk.
And I want to make sure I'm pronouncing this correctly. Boogie as an African American woman.
Bougie.
Bougie. Thank
Bougie.
you.
Ah.
Thank
you. Mm-hmm.
Bougie.
Implications that people of color commit more crime. Someone said assumptions are a trigger for them. As a fellow Asian, model minority is something I can definitely relate to that, being Asian myself. Jesus Christ used as a curse word.
So great contributions. So you want to take us to our next?
Definitely, yes. So as we start thinking about triggers, I think it's pretty obvious how words can very easily divide people in a room. Do you think that we are just stuck with this high level of conflict that we're seeing in our culture today?
No, part of what we're seeing, and we need to be conscious of the effect of media on this, that if you're talking about mainstream media, and I mean that broadly, not ideologically, the sort of large, more broadcast-oriented media, their business is to attract eyeballs to their websites, to their broadcast channels, to their newspaper, whatever it might be. And you just don't attract eyeballs as quickly, so we can think about ourselves on this. We aren't attracted to an interesting, informative story as quickly as we're attracted to something that gets our blood boiling. So using triggers or emphasizing conflict is just, it's been part of the journalistic enterprise and the storytelling enterprise forever. You add the power of social media, and one of the things that I worry about is how quickly we just hit the send button or the reply button or even just the reaction button where we pick a particular emoji. We're not necessarily pausing to reflect on, is that the best way for us to engage conversation? So I think part of what we're seeing is really a function of the way these media are interfacing with the way we behave. And I also think it's missing an important point that actually there are a lot of things on which large majorities of Americans agree. We're not as divided as I think it appears if you read the headlines.
So that's a little surprising to, I know, a lot of people, because we hear so much about how divided we are, et cetera, et cetera. Can you give us some examples of the important areas that you feel that we are in agreement?
Yeah, let me give you two. So I'm going to just suggest, if you're curious about this, look at the Voice of the People project, which works with Stanford and the University of Maryland, just in general, because they do this ongoing process called deliberative democracy with large samples, where they present them information about legislation currently before Congress. And every time they do that, they find all of these areas of broad bipartisan agreement on many of the things that are before Congress at any given point in time. So even on issues of policy, there's much more agreement than we might imagine. But let me share with you some agreement on what I think are more fundamental ideas. And these are all poll results, relatively recent poll results. So regardless of party, so this is whether Republican or Democrat or independent or something else, 2/3 of all Americans, regardless of party, so 2/3 Republicans, 2/3 of Democrats or more, believe that, here's the question they were responding to, it is very important for women to have equal rights with men. Not just equal rights are good, but it's actually very important. That language elicited 2/3 response in favor, whether they were Republicans, Democrats, Independents. 3/4 of all Americans, again, regardless of party, Republicans, Democrats alike, believe that it should be illegal for, and here's what they're responding to, employers to fire or refuse to hire people because they are lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. That's 3/4 across the party spectrum. And more than half of all Americans, again, across the party spectrum, believe that, quote, having strong anti-discrimination policies that ensure that everyone, this is in reference to race, is treated fairly would help their community thrive economically. Now, thinking about what we hear in the press and the controversies that we see, I think those are kind of some stunning numbers to say, no, there isn't massive disagreement. It's a great comment to get that right. This does mean there are significant minority population, minority of the public that doesn't agree with these statements or that's undecided. But still, you have to focus on the fact that these are large majorities on these issues.
So that is really encouraging to see that there is large groups of people across the country who are in agreement with this. But do you feel that people might just be saying that they favor equality or oppose discrimination, and that people, want to say these things because they want to be saying the correct thing, but that's very different from really recognizing and being willing to address the problems of implicit bias and structural racism?
Yeah, that's a very fair point. And if you know anything of this literature of what academics do when they're interested in assessing public opinion about important principles of democracy, it's almost a game. We'll ask questions. So, do you believe in free speech? And then we'll ask about specific people having free speech, and we get very different percentages of answers. So, okay, point well taken. I also think, however, it's important to recognize that if we agree on an important idea, a principle, then we have something to work with. We can point people to that principle, have a conversation about the implications of that principle. We're not trying to convince them that something is right or wrong in principle. We're asking them to think about the implications of their beliefs about what's good, bad, right, and wrong for some aspect of policy, some way we interact, something that's going on in our society.
But Scott, wouldn't you say that people's beliefs are limited to their life experience and how they show up in the world or how they experience the world?
Yeah, I think that's a very important part of the story, that until you've been through an experience or at least known someone who has, it's often hard to see it.
Yeah, it's like the conversations that we're having right now around COVID. If you don't know anybody who's had it and you hadn't seen anybody get sick or die, you don't have any friends who've lost family members, then to you, it's still this thing out in the ether, But if you personally have been impacted by it, there's a different feeling you have about it than those who haven't.
And you made that point very clearly some time back. I'll just note, Schwanda, because we were talking about this with a group of people, and many of us had not had any direct contact with someone being sick from COVID or being really sick. And so you reframed that for us and reminded us with real world examples of people who had.
So, Scott, I want to talk a little bit about how we show up in the world. And I will tell you that I've been giving this a lot of thought because understanding how my experiences can be so different from others' experiences has caused me to become a lot more compassionate and understanding this year than I think I have been in times past. And so this year I had the most interesting experience, maybe a month after George Floyd's murder. I was in the grocery store and I went to a grocery store in a neighborhood that's predominantly white because I wanted the things I needed to get and I knew they would be there. So I went to that grocery store and I had the most interesting experience. I came to check out. First of all, when I walked in the grocery store, I was greeted immediately. And a young man asked me if there was anything he could help me find. And when I told him what I was looking for, he walked me to the aisle where it was and showed me where it was. And I thought, wow, this is world-class service. Then I got to the line and, I just had the two things in my hand that I came for. And a lady that was next to me with the whole cart said, why don't you go ahead of me? And I said, oh, that's okay. I'm not in any rush. And she said, no, you go ahead. And I said, no, ma'am, you go ahead. I'm not in a rush. So I let her go, but I thought that was so nice. It doesn't usually happen to me at the grocery store. And then the manager of the grocery store walked over and said, "Ma'am, come, I'll open this line for you. Come over this way." And I'm thinking, "This is the best customer service I've ever received in my life." And I thought to myself, is this the kind of customer service that people get all the time? And it was shocking to me to step back and think that maybe, just maybe, people are being a little bit more conscious of how they treat people that look like me because of what's going on in the world. But I wondered if that experience was an experience that people had all the time. And I just never realized it because that level of customer service was never given to me. And so it really made me think about how the way we show up in the world will impact how we see. If I went around telling people, "Oh, that grocery store is terrible, I never get good customer service there," and they'd look at me and say, "This grocery store is great. We always get good customer service." Well, we have two different perspectives of our experience based on how we show up in the world. And it's important for us to recognize that when we're talking about difficult conversations.
And for me, I'm 63 years old, white male, tall, a little shaggy right now. That's a COVID thing. But generally speaking, I would say I probably present in the way that makes people fairly comfortable, kind of a professional style. And so my comment when Schwanda was sharing the story with me some time back was, I have a very different experience in stores. I'm always treated well. But so I'm not greeted as enthusiastically typically, but I'm always treated decently. And then you had a story about the flip side of this, where you were shopping and you were treated in a very different way. By the way, sharing a slide with you. Thank you, Mariah, for this image to think about where we stand and how that affects what we see. So where we show up in the world. So, Schwanda, you want to share your less pleasant story?
So as I began to, mature in my professional career, I realized that there was a huge difference from how I was treated when I would go shopping right after work, dressed in my suit or dressed up, versus coming from the gym or on the weekends when I'm in more casual clothing. And so knowing this, I actually would make it a point to plan my shopping for after work to have the ultimate, the most pleasant experience possible. And so during the beginning of COVID, when a lot of us were working from home, most of us weren't really dressing up at all. We had, our favorite leggings or jeggings that we wore on a regular basis, and we were dressed pretty comfortably because we were home. And so one day in particular, I went to a store to look for something because we were heading back to the office and we were going to be taking our corporate headshots and we needed to be dressed up. So I went to one of my favorite department stores and I went to look for something to wear. And I noticed right away from the time that I walked in the store that no one greeted me, but that there was a worker that kind of was following me around from aisle to aisle. She was keeping a bit of a distance at first, but the more I lingered in one area looking at one thing or another, she just kind of was hanging around. So, with everything that went on this summer, I realized I just didn't have the patience for it today. And I looked at her and I said, "Did they tell you on that walkie-talkie to follow me around?" And she said to me, "What?" She's startled. She's taken aback. And I said, "Did they tell you to follow me around the store? I'm just shopping for work clothes. If that's okay, I'd like to do it in peace." And she said, "I'm not following you. I'm just looking for a gift for my daughter." But immediately she disappeared. And I didn't see her or anyone else trailing me or following me for the rest of my shopping experience. And it was a pleasant one. I found what I needed and I bought it and I left. But I thought to myself, what is the practice? What is the belief system? What causes you to believe that if you see somebody that looks like me in sweatpants and a t-shirt, that I'm the one that you follow around the store? And these are the things that we have to remember, that, we have to dismantle these beliefs that if you see somebody that looks a certain way, you make these assumptions. Like somebody said, assumptions are their trigger. You make these assumptions and those assumptions guide your actions. There needs to be a second thought and a third thought and a way to start reprogramming how we think about these things in order to have effective communication with others.
And as a white male shopping, going through the stores over, again, 63, so I'm shopping for a long time. I've never been followed around in a store. Maybe when I was a teenager, maybe, but not as an adult ever. And it didn't matter whether I showed up in blue jeans or in a t-shirt or, full dress uniform for work, never followed around. In fact, I joked with Schwanda if she told me that story. I said, well, at least you got attention, because I'll often walk in a store and nobody notices, but that's a problem on customer service. No, it's not good. And it reflects, I could go through my whole life and never see the experience that Schwanda had, which doesn't make her experience invalid or not true. It's just, I've never seen it because the way I show up in the world, it never happens to me. And unless I'm, and frankly, you know, if someone is with me, if Schwanda's with me and we're someplace, probably the dynamic is different than if Schwanda's shopping in certain places by herself. And so we need to be open to the idea that we see things differently just because of the way we show up, not because of any intention. Simply we show up in the world differently, and that means we have different experiences.
And I can absolutely relate to that because I haven't had that experience, but I know that my mom, with her accent, even though she lived in this country for half a century, had an accent. And so I can, you know, I've shared that experience with her when I've been shopping with her. And if I stepped away from her, I would see how she would be treated versus if I was there, how she would be treated. So all these different perspectives that we have, how do you think that they help us engage in constructive conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion?
So one of the things that we do with these conversations, Sangeeta, is Schwanda and I have kind of adopted a model of backing in to the conversation, and precisely because of our awareness of triggers. So we start talking about racism, not that it's not a real thing and not that we don't need to talk about it, but we start by talking about racism and people trigger, and they react. Even talking about race or ethnicity or gender, again, people trigger. So we've started exploring having these conversations by kind of backing in, thinking about all of the components of our identity. So I want to share, this is probably something many of you have seen before, but it's an image that helps to reinforce how we have an opportunity to have a conversation that allows us to kind of back in. And this has to do with what are called the primary and secondary dimensions of identity. I'll add that I think even these distinctions between primary and secondary are becoming more complex and less defensible in some cases. But the idea is that the things that are in the primary or inner circle are, on the one hand, things that are, if you will, essentially given. They are what they are. And often, though not always, they're apparent. People can observe them, or they may think they observe them. They may perceive something, whether it's present or not. And so the idea here is any of these is a part of who I am. So I talked about being 63. I'm also male. I'm also white. In fact, I'm white Anglo-Saxon Catholic. I'm just different last letter. But the second area of identity, the secondary dimension, is also important, especially when we're framing conversations in terms of how we show up in the world. And I'll give you an example of something that I'm going to come back to in just a moment, but I grew up outside Detroit. And if you know the geography of that part of the United States, Detroit is right across the border from Canada and from Windsor in particular. But that's an area of Canada where French is spoken with a relatively high frequency. And so growing up outside Detroit, one of the things I learned was French because the school system taught French because there was enough exchange between Canadians who spoke French and people who lived in the Detroit area. So all of these things affect how we experience the world. And those differences can lead to some differences in the kind of experience we have. Shwanda, do you have an example you want to work with?
You know, Scott, age is one of those areas of identity that I think can be really controversial in the workplace, because what we're seeing in a lot of workplaces is that older employees are feeling like they're being pushed out so that room can be created to hire new employees that are younger and less expensive, frankly, to have. And when I worked in a place where we had to stop and think about the fact that we were creating one of those kind of workspaces, and we had to acknowledge that age as an identity was something that we needed to value. People of all ages, we needed to make sure we had a diverse environment where people can contribute from every age level. So we made a conscious effort to look at applicants who had long resumes, you know, multiple pages and lots of experience, and bring them onto younger teams that were forming to work for younger supervisors even, so that we could get the perspective of their experience in the workplace. And I think it's really important when we think about these levels of identity and we think about privilege and we think about all of these topics that pertain to diversity, that we realize it's not just black and white. We're not just talking about race. When we're talking about the work of diversity, equity, inclusion, we need to be looking at all of these primary identities as well as the secondary identities and creating very diverse and inclusive spaces.
And not just to be sure we're being fair, but also
Mhm.
it provides a way to talk because
Mhm.
you may be very comfortable talking about, for example, regional differences and even be able to joke about how they experience the world differently because of where they grew up, say in the United States. And then that creates a way to talk about how what may be more critically important elements of identity affect how people show up in the world in a differential way.
Okay. So how do we take all these different aspects of our identity and talk about something like privilege, which also has different aspects?
An important starting point is to just be sure we understand, I think, that when we talk about privilege, we need to talk about privilege descriptively, not judgmentally. That privilege is a thing. It's, and that one can have privilege by virtue of some aspect of one's experience or one's identity. It's just a thing. It's a description of reality. Fun?
So thank you. When we talk about privilege, the one thing that we always get pushback, from folks who may say, well, I hate hearing about privilege because I worked really hard and I grew up really poor and I pulled myself up by the bootstraps and everything I have today I work for. And I always like to remind them that most of what constitutes your privilege, you had nothing to do with. So I say, if you're able to raise your hand and ask this question or make this comment, that's a privilege. Because for folks that are not able bodied, that can't raise their hand or that cannot speak, they would have to have another way to be able to communicate their feelings about what I just said. And then I say, and if you're in this room and you can't raise your hand and you can't speak, but you have some sort of assistive technology that allows you to be able to communicate with the speakers, then you are exercising a degree of privilege that others that are, in a less fortunate position don't have. And so I like to make sure that I emphasize that we all have privilege. The fact that we are able to come together like this during a work day and discuss this very important topic is a privilege. There are some folks who wanted to be here today that couldn't do it because they couldn't access a tool like this during the middle of the day. And I want to make sure that we understand that we all have some degree of privilege, but privilege is not a bad word. It's about using the privilege you have and using the power you have to create equity for somebody else. And so if we all collectively understand that there's a responsibility that comes with privilege, there's not a burden, it's not a task to be privileged. What it is using the privilege that you have in order to help others and create equity around you.
That sounds like you're teeing up a breakout session, Shwanda.
I am. So Scott, if you don't mind throwing back up that slide really quickly with the identity wheel, just so that folks have an opportunity to see some of the different types of identity that they can recognize as their own. If you want to just take a moment to think about the dimensions of identity and think about where you have experienced privilege, so whether it's age, ethnicity, being able-bodied or not, sexual orientation, gender, race, think about some of your privilege. And then think about how that impacts how you show up in the world and the opportunities that you have that others may not have. And then Scott, we can flip to the next breakout. I just wanted to give them a chance to see those dimensions of identity before we move on. So we're going to just take a moment before we move into the rooms. If you can, whether you're taking notes on your phone or with the pen and pad or just thinking about it, if you could take a moment to jot down some thoughts about some aspects of your identity and how they've given you privilege in certain situations, the way that Scott shared. When you're in the breakout room, we just want you to have a chance to talk a little bit about privilege. So whether something can be a privilege in one situation that's not a privilege in another. A joke I make with Scott is that I think it's a privilege to be a woman that's 5 feet tall because I'm able to find clothes most places where I go to shop. I don't have to worry about finding clothes like some of my taller friends do. I'm able to, when young and dating, I didn't have to worry about whether guys were short or tall because I could date either one. So it was a privilege. But when I go to the grocery store and I'm trying to reach things on that top shelf, it's not a privilege to be 5 feet tall. So, there's some situations in which how you identify or how you show up in the world can be a privilege, and then other ways that it's not. But we want you to just think about some of your aspects of your identity and how they can be a privilege in a given situation.
Mariah, are you ready to send them off to their breakout rooms? All right. Again, this is short, just like 5 minutes.
So I figured out this time I have to reassign them before I send them. I didn't catch that last time.
And I will copy that.
The rooms are filling up and I'm seeing that nobody has just 2 right now. Is that correct? Oh, room 4 has just 2.
A couple people might. Spiros and Kim, you may need to click on the join the room or go to the room button.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay.
All right. Perfect.
Yeah, so room 4 ended up with 2. No, Kimberly just joined. Okay.
Good. Okay. Perfect. So they have 3.
Yay.
All
Okay.
right.
I just checked the email. We're fine. We've got nothing coming through on email. So we're good on that.
Sangeeta, you've been doing amazing with keeping up with the questions. Thank you so
Oh.
much. for that.
You're
But I
welcome.
made a curve and skip one because
Yep.
I saw that that we just went through, but it's okay. You guys are amazing in putting together this document. It's fabulous. I was sharing with Mariah. I'm not sure, Scott, if you were on that. I took Monday and Tuesday off, so I was trying to keep up with the emails. And I think the lesson learned is I'm not going to do that before a talking again.
I hear that. I hear that. Right. I had the privilege of sharing the run of show with my daughter-in-law, who is a stage manager, and she taught me the run of show concept.
This is beautifully done.
This is pretty common for production. So I was a production assistant at KPBS and we always had it. So I've actually been taking notes of the projected time and our actual time. And we're like within 2 minutes of our projected
Yeah.
time. We're doing really
Wow, Scott, you're amazing.
I was checking that out. I'm like, okay, it says we're at 1:45. We're supposed to be talking about breakout rooms, and here we are.
good.
So it's really well done. Thank you for taking the time to do this.
Sangeeta, I apologize. I think I thought it was my turn and then I started to talk and then you started to talk. I think I cut you off in the intro.
Oh no, don't worry about it. I didn't even notice actually.
Yeah, I didn't
Okay.
notice that either.
Okay. One of my employees, Renice, actually posted something about disparities in home ownership.
I saw
And
that.
And I'm going to talk about that.
Yep, I posted that on my Instagram yesterday, actually. The
Yeah,
article. Yep.
especially in the Bay Area is impossible to own anyways in California, but there's are you guys alluding to that at all? And I know that's a whole other conversation, but
Yeah, I actually have, when we get into talking about shift from, okay, so everybody has privilege to how does this affect our conversation in ways that matter with regard to things like race.
Mhm.
When I shift to talking about there are structural patterns
Mhm.
of privilege, and we're talking specifically about the financial piece. That's like the second question that Sangeeta is going to ask after we wrap up the breakout room. And I have 2 slides that are graphs about wealth. One's about wealth, one's about home ownership by race. And then I have the short demonstration about the impact of being able to own property and then sell it on the next generation, a little exercise that we talked about that I've got.
will you do a little shout out and say, I see there was a comment about this in the section, something like that?
Yes. Yep.
She, as my employee, she'd be very happy you did that.
Who was that?
VIP treatment.
Who was that? Do you remember who it was?
Yep, Renice Gray.
Louise. Okay. Yeah.
And my stomach is beating me up right now, so I'm eating some crackers, but I'm on mute.
Okay.
So there is a comment also by someone from one of your graphs that said, so 1/3 of people who say, no, actually women shouldn't have equal rights with men. Wow.
Yeah, he spoke to that earlier when Takia first posted that.
It's
Right. And you have to be careful because in responding to the specific question, I emphasized it's very important because that's the item that it's
right.
very important. And so some of those people are saying it's important, but really, we're past that or whatever. So they're not saying it's not important. And I didn't show that. Right. I mean, it's not everybody who thinks it's very important.
Mm-hmm.
If we were past that, we wouldn't be having the, it wouldn't be necessary to even ask that question if we were important. Okay, so it says
Hold on, hold
time
on,
is
hold on,
up.
hold on.
Yep,
Hold
good.
on.
Yeah.
I'm noticing the presentation goes all the way till 2:30. Is that right?
Right.
Right, because we're not doing the Q&A, it's being
Do it.
put through. They've changed the format a little bit.
Oh, I missed that. Okay, I'm gonna
Okay.
open them up now.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, close now, right? Shouldn't send them all home. I'll come back to the main room. Shwanda, you can invite them to post.
They're not coming back. What did I do?
Nothing. It's they're going to take every second they can now that they understand they can
They get a
stay.
30-second countdown.
Right.
Oh, okay.
There we go.
There we go. Like, oh no, what did I do?
And just wrap it up their
Welcome back.
conversation. They realize
Last night I was talking to my class, going on and on and on mute, and then somebody finally told me. I was like, oh.
not good, not good.
Welcome back. Welcome back. So we want to hear from you all. Please start sharing in the chat. What are some of the privileges that you discussed in your group?
Yeah, one of the things while we're waiting for those to show up, and it'll take just a moment, Shwanda, when we used the privilege walk one year and a number of trainings, and I hope people have had a chance to experience a privilege walk. It's a really powerful exercise. I remember when we were picking the particular items in the privilege walk and talking about them, my reaction to the idea that if you grew up in a household with more than 50 books, you have privilege. That's because in my household, 50 books, that was just in one room. There were books everywhere. And I never thought of it as a privilege, but anytime I wanted something to read, there was always something to read. Reading was normative. And we know reading is associated with learning. It's associated with opportunity. So never thought it was privilege. White and college educated.
I see. Not worrying about choosing between food and the mortgage. Absolutely.
Appreciate Aaron's comment about two things can be true at the same time, and we're going to be talking about that a lot. Continue to talk about it.
He's setting up the next conversation. All right, so we have language, definitely, like being able to, being a native English speaker versus not is definitely a privilege.
Leanne, I see your question. We'll point you to some resources for a privilege walk. They're easily there. You can find them online.
Oh, great. Then I'll just do that. Thank you.
There's some good
You can usually tailor the questions that you want to use. You'll find some list of 50 or 100, so you can kind of just pick and choose what you want to use for the group that you're working with, Leanne.
Is that where everyone kind of takes a step forward if this thing applies to them?
Or
There's a
step back.
There's a powerful video on that too.
And it has unexpected consequences. And I'll just add, if you choose to use a privilege walk in any setting, be prepared for some strong emotional responses, because that happens. Just because people are confronting either their sense of, wow, I didn't realize I had that privilege, or realizing that they didn't have privileges that they've never really thought about. So it can touch some pretty raw nerves. You have to be sure you help people debrief it effectively.
Scott, I love Karen's comment because she talks about how you can use your privilege to create equity for others. So for instance, being able to assist others to translate when they're struggling to communicate. That is a perfect example. You get an A, a perfect example of how you can use your privilege to create equity. Thank you for that.
Sangeeta?
So I think when we're talking about privilege, I absolutely agree with you that it's really hard because it feels like an accusation. And I think you made a really great point when you said that it also makes us aware of the privileges we didn't have. And it can cause a lot of feelings that we have to then work through.
Yeah, I think from having worked on this issue for a while and learned a lot, I recognize that I've gone through life with a tremendous amount of privilege. And so I've had to deal with what I think naturally falls on people who have some compassion, at least, is that, okay, then there's guilt that comes after that. It's like, wait, I have all this privilege. I feel guilty for having this privilege. And as Schwanda said earlier, when we're talking about privilege carefully, we're really talking about something that we didn't do. Growing up in a household with more than 50 books in the house, I didn't pick the household where I grew up. That was my parents. And I didn't pick my parents either. And being conscious of this, okay, privilege is something that we have. It's a resource that we can use, not a club that we should beat ourselves up about. If you have privilege, and we all have privilege in some settings, acknowledging that, being comfortable saying, yep, I have that. And now what am I going to do with it?
Mhm.
So if you believe that, and I believe I agree with you that everybody has privilege of some sort or another, why do you think this is an important concept to work with while we're having all of these really important discussions?
Right. So, if we can get people comfortable with the idea that, yes, I have privilege, you have privilege, and we all have privilege in certain settings. Now, privilege doesn't have to be a trigger word. And we can ask the question, are there some folks who are more likely to have more wide-ranging privilege than others? And are there certain aspects of identity that are associated with that greater likelihood of privilege? And that's where we can say, data tells us the answer to that question is yes. And we're going to focus on race and ethnicity. So I'm going to share a couple of screens with you now to show a couple graphs to make sure this is clear. So this is coming from the Federal Reserve in a recent report, I think 2019. This is about net worth. So if you will, this is about wealth. Take all the assets, detract all of the liabilities. What do you have left? And this is in thousands of dollars. So if we're talking about median net worth, and I always prefer the median, because if you don't know that in stats, that's literally the value that is in the middle of the population. Half of that population have less and half have more, whereas the mean can be distorted by Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, those people with incredible amounts of wealth. So let's look at median, and the median net worth of white families, white households in the United States is close to $200,000. And you might say, well, where is that? And I'm going to come back to this, but the point that what drives that for most people is home ownership. And we'll talk more about that, and the kind of home and the neighborhood and so on. And you can just compare that with median net worth for Black families, which is right around $24,000. The contrast is just stunning. And obviously, having assets, having some access to capital is a huge privilege. Now, you can say, I earned that, I worked for that, I got it. And we're going to come back to that idea. But recognize that part of what allows us to have the assets we have financially, if we have them, is what happened in the generation before us,
Right.
and the generation before that, the generation before that.
Now, Scott, before you move on, I want to point out that with the median net worth, what this is doing is also subtracting the amount of debt you have against the assets. And so what we know for certain is that student loan debt in the Black community is one of the big factors pulling down that number of your net worth. So what happened in the generation before was, if your parents were able to pay for you to go to college or to get higher education and you didn't have to take out loans, then you start out in a better place than if you have to start out from negative 10,000, 20,000, upwards of $200,000. And so that's what we're thinking about when we're thinking about privilege. We're thinking about what you had no control over, what you were born into, what generations before you, what impacted them, and how what impacted them ends up impacting you.
Yeah, and just again, to personalize this, to own it, right? So because we all have privilege, and being comfortable being able to say, this is where I've had privilege. So in my instance, I went to college at a good school on bachelor's degree, no debt. My parents paid for whatever I didn't have scholarship for, and the scholarship wasn't that big. That's a huge difference from colleagues of mine, including, frankly, my wife, who went to the same school, who had to take out a lot of debt in order to be able to complete her college education. Yeah, so it's a number of factors. There we go. So now let me take to that second slide. This is about home ownership. Okay. And again, home ownership by age and race. And you can see that those under 35, slightly less than 50%, but look at that number, almost 50% of whites have a home that they own, meaning they have a mortgage, they're paying on it, but they own it, compared to just shy of 20% of Black households and just shy of 30% of Hispanic households, and other just shy of 30%. So that's a big difference, because you think about a mortgage, and you know, home ownership is about, I have a home probably with a mortgage. So if you're starting on that under 35, you will own that house outright by the time you are approaching retirement. Whereas if you start into home ownership when you are in your 40s, you may or may not be able to have that house outright by the time you're approaching retirement. So you can see the contrast persists through the different age groups, that there is a difference. And home ownership in the United States is one of the fundamental ways that A, families accumulate wealth, and B, that they pass on wealth from one generation to the next. So I want to conclude this little conversation about, it's important to acknowledge this privilege of economic opportunity by answering briefly the question, so why is there such a difference? And all one needs to do is look at decades of policies, federal and local, business practices, formal express discrimination. There are reasons why home ownership is more common among whites, and why better asset in home ownership is more common among whites, that have everything to do with systemic racism, with choices that were made, you know, not by me, not by anybody on this call, to set rules about where low interest loans would be available from the FHA, and whether or not someone could even get such a loan. And if it matters generationally, then even if today we've addressed those problems, maybe that stuff is all taken care of, though there's good reason to suspect it's not in some important ways. But even if we've made progress, the advantage of being able to start on this path of wealth accumulation through simple things like home ownership decades ago has a profound impact on family well-being. That opportunity is privilege. And I'm going to do this little exercise to illustrate the points. I have 4 people in this story. This is hypothetical, but hopefully the assumptions will make sense to you. So I'm going to assume we're going to talk about 4 people, all of whom have the ability to invest whatever resources they have at 5% annual interest, simple annual interest, not compounded, just 5%, just keep the model simple. And we have simple saver. This is someone who recognizes that being frugal is a good thing. They're working hard, they're young, they're 25, and they say, you know, I need to start saving. So they make a commitment to themselves to save $50 a month, and every year to ratchet that up by 5%. So at the end of the first year, they've saved $600, and in the next year it's $630 because that's 5% more, plus the $600 they had has accrued 5% interest, and that's going to continue. They're just going to keep doing that. Then we have serious investor. This is someone who is taking a much more aggressive approach to building up a nest egg. They want to have assets for retirement, for whatever. And so they're making the stunning commitment at 25 of saving $200 a month. And immediately, I'm assuming some of you are going to react as I do when I was creating this. It's like, there's no way. There's no way. But humor me on this. Let's imagine that somebody does this. It's okay, $200 a month, every month, and every year increase that amount by 5% and invest what I've saved at 5% annual interest, uncompounded. So they've saved $2,400 the first year. The second year, they're going to save $2,520, and the money's going to accumulate 5% interest as they go. 2 people working hard, saving money. And then there's Lucky. Lucky and his or her sibling have a grandparent who just recently passed away. Now, that's not lucky. That's sad. However, the grandparent named Lucky and his or her sibling in the will to receive the proceeds of the sale of grandparents' home. And when all's said and done, the house sells for $200,000. So Lucky gets a $100,000 gift. That's the inheritance from just the fact that the grandparents owned the house. That was worth $200,000. Lucky says, I'm going to save every dime of that. I'm going to set that aside. That's my nest egg. So Lucky sets it aside, and it's going to earn 5% annual interest, just plain. And Lucky does nothing else. Not saving a dime ever, but they're just not going to touch that $100,000. Then there's Luckier, who's the sole grandchild, or maybe the beloved grandchild of a grandparent who, again, sadly just passed away, who also owned a house that sells for $200,000 when all the expenses are paid. And Luckier gets that entire gift and does the same thing Lucky did. I'm going to take that $200,000. I'm going to invest it. I'm never going to touch it. And I'm never going to save another dime. Fast forward, they're 25 when this happens. Fast forward 40 years. They're now 65. Simple saver who started out saving $50 a month is now saving $4,000 a year. So they've been ratcheting it up. And their balance after 40 years of this diligent effort is $173,000. Not bad. Won't do well for retirement all by itself, but okay, not bad. Serious investor, that $200 a month, ratcheted up 5% per year, is now saving $16,000, almost $17,000 a year. And they have a nice nest egg, almost $700,000 that they've accumulated. But Lucky, who was lucky enough to receive an inheritance of $100,000 from the proceeds, half the proceeds of a grandparent's home, and saved not a dime, has more money in that nest egg after 40 years, slightly more, than serious investor who worked incredibly hard. And luckier, of course, twice the asset on the front end, twice the asset on the back end, $1.4 million for doing nothing other than having the privilege of a grandparent who deeded the proceeds of their home in inheritance to luckier when the grandparent died. Now, we need to stress again, privilege is not a judgment. It's not condemning. It's just being honest that if our family has the opportunity to own a home, if that's gone on for a few generations, there's an opportunity, not a guarantee, but an opportunity to accumulate a substantial amount of wealth that a family that did not have that opportunity because of laws, because of prejudice, because of regulations, because of lack of access to capital, they can try really hard to build up a nest egg, and trying really hard, they might be able to catch up. That's the power of privilege as it associates with race in our society.
That's a very powerful slide. And so with all of this conversation and all of these tips, et cetera, that we've discussed up until now, you've given us a way to approach difficult conversations about DEI that seems like we can get started without necessarily triggering a reaction from other people. But what would you say to people who are then worried that once we've started this conversation, what happens when it starts to unravel? And it seems like right now, especially, it could take a very tiny thread to kind of unravel the entire conversation. What would you say to them?
It's funny you asked that, Sangeeta, because I find more recently people just kind of avoiding conversations altogether because they don't want to pull that thread and unravel the whole thing. People will delete friends on Facebook or just get off of Facebook altogether because they can't take all the back and forth anymore. And I get that, but there are definitely ways that we can engage each other more constructively. And Scott's going to go over a model of that. But before we get there, I want to talk a little bit about making the commitment to stay engaged, having these conversations, because it's tough. You know, with one of my triggers is cancel culture. I hate cancel culture. I think that there should be room and space for people to make mistakes and learn from the mistakes and then become better people. And if we say because you made a mistake that we're canceling you forever, where's the room for growth in that? And how are we all better as a result of that? So Scott, if you could put up the slide about the journey to cultural competence, when we make a decision to stay engaged, to get to a better place than our level of understanding that we have now, I think that's how we get to the place of being unconsciously competent. But let's talk about this a little bit. So we start at unconsciously incompetent when it comes to issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I consider myself to be an ally of the LGBTQ plus community. There's so much I don't know because I'm not a member of that community. But it's important for me to recognize that I'm going to be incompetent. I'm going to make mistakes. I'm going to say something wrong. It's going to offend. And what matters is that if I've made the commitment that I believe that every human being is worthy of love and to be loved, that even when I'm wrong and even when somebody has to tell me that I've messed up, that takes me from a place of being unconsciously incompetent to consciously competent. So the next time that I say something, I'm going to think about, okay, I messed up that time and they corrected me. Let me make sure I use the right language this time. Let me make sure that I engage correctly this time to make people feel comfortable and included. And in time, the more that I expose myself, the more knowledge I gain, the more interactions I have, I'll get to a place where it's second nature. I'll use the right pronouns, I'll say the right things, and I'll be unconsciously competent. And that way, I have made a commitment to stumble, to fall on the journey, to mess up, but to stay engaged and stay in the journey so that I can effectively communicate in a way with all people that makes them feel comfortable. And so this is just a commitment that we have to be willing to make if we want to see a more diverse and inclusive world, if we want to create more diverse and equitable spaces where we work, where we go to church, where we go to school, etc.
And it's a commitment to stay in the journey. It's also, if you will, a commitment to be gentle with ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
We are going to make mistakes. We just are. And we don't, as you know, your example is excellent along those lines. And some of our trigger words are simply things people say by mistake, not
Mm-hmm.
realizing that there's something wrong with that. So part of this is about being gentle with ourselves and acknowledging we're on a journey and being willing to own that with someone else we're working with. And part of this is then think about, how do I navigate the difficult conversation once it starts? And we have a model we want to share, which we call the Haddock Model. If you know anything about the haddock as a fish, it's a deep water fish. So this is for deep dives into conversation. And we start with the idea of actually hearing people. So, you know, the expression, oh, I hear you, right? I hear you. And we take that expression seriously. Work when someone is talking about something that's difficult, and you're getting into a hot conversation, listen to the point where we actually hear. We can appreciate the perspective. Second, accept the perspective. Accepting it doesn't mean I agree with you. Accepting it doesn't even mean I think you're being entirely honest with me. All we need to do is simply accept that in this conversation, this person has chosen to present this idea or share this reaction. That's real. And I'm just going to accept that that happened and depersonalize how we deal with it. So when someone lashes out at us in a conversation because of something we did do or something they perceive or for some other reason, not responding with pronouns. It's not your idea or your comment, or we can talk about the subject matter without personalizing the comments. And obviously this also means don't go ad hominem and say, well, you're stupid anyway. I mean, don't attack the person. If there's a conversation we're having about substance, focus on the substance. And we can talk about the substance without naming who said it or who brought it up, which de-escalates. It significantly de-escalates. The opposite is true for our own perspective, that we need, if you will, to personalize in the sense of ownership, our own perspective. So to say what I'm perceiving, the way this affects me, how I see this, not generalizing and saying it's wrong or saying that most people, so no, my experience, or as one of my faculty colleagues said to me, it's always about to me. To me, the expression such and such is an uncomfortable expression, or to me, I don't see that as an act of discrimination, or to me, I find that language to be very offensive or whatever, but owning it. I'm not saying it's flat truth. I'm saying my experience, how I show up in the world. For me, this is the impact, which allows the other person to say, well, I don't see that, or I don't agree, which is good. We can continue the conversation as opposed to forcing them to accept that what we've experienced is the absolute truth. We create space. And finally, we have to care. Shwanda talked about staying engaged, staying committed. The thing that drives this conversation, makes it possible for us to move forward, is actually caring about the person we're dealing with and not wanting to write them off because of attitudes they've expressed, and not wanting to give up on the possibility that somehow we can come together, because we need to come together.
So Scott, Haddock has helped me in all kinds of difficult conversations, but especially in parenting. So it's one of my favorite tools now to use in parenting, because when you are trying to parent intentionally, kids can say things sometimes that make you so angry, and you want to react right away, but you have to take the time to go through these steps. So for instance, this Christmas, when we were planning to decorate, my daughter looked at me and said, Mom, you can be so difficult to work with on projects sometimes. And oh, it hurt. I got immediately offended. I wanted to just recoil and I wanted to react. And then I stopped and I said, can you tell me why you say that? And she said, because, we had a plan for what we were going to do. And then you decided to change the plan, but you didn't tell me that you were changing the plan. So when we went to the store, we weren't getting the things I thought we were going to get. And that's just so frustrating sometimes, Mom. And so then I said, okay, that would frustrate me too. I had to accept that being in a situation like that would frustrate me if I was working with a teammate on a project. And so I depersonalized and I said, okay, I can understand where she's coming from. And then I said to her, well, what would you rather me do? How can I communicate with you in a way that would make you comfortable? I took ownership of what I could do better. And she told me, and at the end I said, it matters to me what you think about working with me on a project. I don't want you to think I'm difficult. I will do better. And it just changed the whole thing, because the first reaction I had was I wanted to say, leave me alone. But I decided to go through the Haddock steps, through the process of that difficult conversation to get to the other side in a better place. And I'm telling you, I truly believe that taking a step back and processing and having your second or third reaction be what you move forward with rather than the first one is really the key to having these difficult conversations.
I would agree. That's a great example. Thank you for sharing that with us. We have a question for Scott. It says, we aren't supposed to say you, but should we say we?
Great question. And I'm going to say it undoubtedly depends on context, and all I can offer you to me what I think makes sense, right? So we don't have to agree. When we say we, the question is, what we are we speaking for? And I personally am very uncomfortable, at least consciously uncomfortable, with speaking for some group of people. I can talk about my own experiences, and I can say to a group, I can bring them together, say, we need to work on this together because it's the only way we can move forward. So the we depends on the context. There are circumstances where I invite people to be a part of something by saying we, but if it's really about making a point of disagreement, me personally, to me, I'm going to say I'm going to say that's my perspective, which maybe they will share, or at least that's what I intend.
So before we wrap up, we want to have one more breakout session and give you one more chance to engage with us. And so Scott's going to bring up the slide for that breakout. We want you to have a chance to practice Haddock. And we're very intentional about not giving you a specific scenario like your child telling you that you're too difficult to work with at Christmas time. We want to leave it pretty open-ended and broad, because we think that everybody can relate to a time when they've been confronted about something they did or something they said that was offensive to somebody else, and they didn't agree with that feedback. So we just want you to imagine that you've received a confrontational email from a coworker. An email meaning you have time to think and go through Haddock before you respond. It's not face-to-face and immediate reaction, but we want you to imagine that you received a confrontational email from a coworker or professional contact in which they criticize your conduct in a way that you think is unfair or untrue. Talk about what it would mean to apply the Haddock method to what might be some element of your response. And I did skip over the Q-tip method is quit taking it personal. So that one's simple. Quit taking it personal. Maybe you can think about ways in which what somebody else is saying or doing really doesn't have anything to do with you at all. And you don't have to react to every single thing. But in our scenario, in our breakout, you're going to be thinking about how you react to this email that you got accusing you of something that you think is just not true or fair. And Scott, maybe we'll just put up the letters for Haddock, what they mean for them one more time so they can see them.
Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put that in the chat first.
Awesome.
So there, it's now theoretically, it's now there for you to see. That's the Haddock. And I'll put the assignment, it's a little bit long, in the chat here in a moment as well.
All right. So we're ready for the breakout.
I figured this out.
You can be a professional here. You can just be a Zoomer.
Okay,
All
is
right.
it just the four of us?
Yep, and everybody has 3. Yay.
Awesome. We're running a couple of minutes behind, but I think you skipping over that, Schwanda, thank you for doing that, that one question. And I think we should be pretty close to being caught up. We may run over a couple of minutes, but I think we'll be all right.
Yeah,
I would say just acknowledge it. Just acknowledge we're running a couple minutes late, and if
Yeah.
invite people to log off if they need to.
Right.
And I'm sorry that I somehow missed that there was no Q&A, that we were just doing it an hour and a half. If I would have read this closer, I would have caught it.
Okay. A lot going on.
Yeah.
Was that you that got a phone call or something earlier, or was it your computer singing?
No, it's
No,
one of the
yeah.
attendees.
It was, yeah.
But they were all muted.
No, she wasn't.
She unmuted herself.
Yeah, I
She
muted her.
somehow, yeah, she somehow got unmuted, and so it was her phone that was ringing.
So they mute upon entry, but they have the opportunity to mute and unmute themselves. Is that bad? I mean, we only had that one small disruption. Should I leave it?
Yeah, I don't think that's a big deal.
Yeah, but I think just some time for the next time, we want to make sure that everyone is muted, because we're lucky, honestly, that we didn't get more of those interruptions.
Mhm.
So is there a setting where I force them to request permission to unmute?
I think when you set up the meeting, so back all the way
Right.
back into the Zoom website, I think you can specify whether people are allowed to unmute themselves. I'm not sure you can do it once you're in the meeting. You can set it so you certainly can set it so they're muted when they come in, and I think they were.
Mhm.
But I think there's a way where you can control whether or not they can unmute themselves without.
So basically, we want them to ask permission to unmute type thing.
If you want them to talk, yep. And it would be
There-
nice. The problem is just with the amount of content we're trying to cover, we knew we'd get derailed.
On the participant list, you can mute all, but I don't think that locks anything. I think it just mutes them all for the time being.
Okay.
Okay, and there's nothing on the email. We're good on that.
Awesome. So I think when we bring them back, we can get some feedback about what they discussed, but we can bring it to the closing moves in order to keep with the time. What do you think?
Yeah, because we still want to ask you about your closing statements. So we
Mhm.
need a couple minutes for that. And then we have just a short, I think it's about a minute for me to close up. Mariah, did you want to say anything in closing, or do you want me to just do it?
No, I just want them to stay tuned to the website for
Right.
our give them the date and time of our next one. We haven't identified a speaker yet. And then they're all going to get a follow-up email with the same information. And the follow-up email will also include the link to the video.
Right. So yeah, I have all of that about, don't forget to sign up for next month, and here's the date for next month. And then our thank you, etc.
Have you sent me the thank you email yet? I can't remember. It's kind of a blur.
I don't think I have. I will get that to you. I'm looking at trying to figure out how to put it on the website, but if you can send it to me as the MP4, not on the website, sorry, on the YouTube channel, I'll work with Bobby to make sure that it's up, and then I'll give you the wording with the proper links.
Okay, so I'm going to get a hyperlink from Zoom shortly after this meeting.
Okay.
Do you want me to post that hyperlink in the email to everybody saying thank you for attending today? Here's a recording of the session.
What is the link to?
The
Bless
video.
you.
Excuse me.
No, I know that, but where does it go to? Where does it direct them?
It's hosted on Zooms.
It's hosted on Zoom, but
there's
we
like
want to keep it. Sorry, go ahead.
It's hosted on their platform. So you have to, you go to the hyperlink and you put in a password.
Okay. Let's talk about this because I think it should be coming up shortly that their breakouts are finishing up.
So hold off on that email.
Yeah.
I just created a slide so we can finesse the issue of really not be able to take feedback from their breakouts. We put a slide up that has our contact emails, Schwanda, and they're saying, share with us, send us an email, share with us what you've experienced and or any questions, and we can just say, we ran a little short on time. So take a moment, share with us something from your discussion or any questions.
Okay. It's doing a
I'll
countdown.
do that, Scott.
Close rooms. Okay.
Yep. Close them now.
Go ahead and close them. Okay.
Yep. Bring them back.
So they'll be back in 30 seconds.
Oh, so when I hit close, that's when it gives them 30 seconds. Okay.
Right.
Sorry, I just had a sneezing fit.
All right. So sorry, Scott, is this a change in plan? So Schwanda's not going to ask them to post anything in chat right now?
I'm just thinking, looking at the time, it's up to you. I mean, Schwanda, what do you think?
We can just ask them to stay another 5 minutes.
Okay.
It's up to you.
I think acknowledge that we're running over, and
Right.
if anyone has to go, they can go, but we have 5 more minutes.
Okay.
All right, welcome back.
So is everybody back? I think we are. So I just want to, as a time check, say that we're running probably about 5 minutes late. If you need to go, please, by all means, feel free to leave. There will be a recording of this that will be sent out to, the link will be sent out to everyone. But in the meantime, Schwanda, do you want to have them post in the chat any questions that came out during their breakout session?
Sure. Please share any feedback that you have from your breakout sessions in the chat. And also, Scott, do you mind putting up a slide with our contact information if anyone wants to reach out or connect with us in the future?
And so this is a good time in the chat to post things from this breakout, but also if you've had a question that you wanted to have us try to address before we wrap up, put it in the chat as well. And I've just shared the email addresses for Schwanda and myself. Should you want to follow up with questions or comments, we welcome all of that. We are on the journey of cultural competence, and your perspective will help us understand how to do it even better.
So Scott, before we wrap up, I just want to leave everyone with a final thought. Recently, I watched a program on PBS about women in policing and about the level of compassion that women bring to that field. And one of the women said something that really stuck with me. She said, as a police officer, it can be difficult to see people doing some of the most despicable things sometimes and have respect for them as a human. You can see them, doing, maybe you've come to a call where a man has just beat his wife and he's wielding a gun and you're thinking like, this man's the scum of the earth. But at the end of the day, she said, all that they have to give each person they encounter is the respect of their humanity. So even if you don't feel respect in that moment, maybe sometimes you just have to pretend to respect them. Maybe you just say, I respect myself enough to be a professional as a police officer to handle this situation the right way, even if I'm struggling to respect the person that I'm engaging with. And I really internalized that as a personal goal. I want to be able to have enough respect for myself to respect everyone I'm engaging with, even when they believe something that I don't believe, even when they've said something to me that has triggered me or makes me feel disrespected. I owe them and I owe myself enough respect to show respect to others. And so at the end of the day, that's my takeaway for having difficult conversations. If you start from a place of respect for self, respect for the humanity of others, then you can get to a place of understanding in time.
And that
Right.
that point you made, Schwanda, about respect not being something that we sometimes feel toward that person in the moment, I think is also critically important. Respect is not a feeling. We can have that feeling, but to choose to respect a person, that's a choice. And I think that choice is critically important. It reminds me of when my wife and I were being trained to adopt from the foster care system. And the coaches were talking to us about the reality of adopting an older child, maybe a child with some significant problems. And that there were going to be times, there might be long times when you just didn't feel that bond with the child that you might imagine feeling with a birth child. And so somebody said, well, so what do you do in those situations? And the coach said, fake it till you make it. Choose to act in love, because the more you act out of love, the more you will love. The same is true for respect. The more we choose to act with respect, the more respect we will feel toward others.
That's a great way, I think, to end the session. There's two great comments in the chat, which I will let everybody read, just to be respectful of people's times. Scott and Schwanda, Mariah and I want to thank you so very much. You guys were awesome in our planning of this, in helping us brainstorm all of this, and then, really giving us so generously of your time to pull all of this together. So we really want to thank you for taking the time to chat with all of us today. Being able to communicate effectively is so important as we address all the real issues that are facing our country. With a high level of food insecurity in our communities, we wanted to do something a little bit different for speaker gifts. So Mariah and I will be making a donation to Feed America as a thank you to both of you for taking the time to share your expertise with all of us and helping us to learn to communicate in a way that everyone can really hear what it is that we're trying to say. As a reminder, the recording for today's talk will be available to all of you, and you'll receive the link in the next day or so. Please don't forget to sign up for next month's talk on March 17th. We want to thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing all of you on March 17th. Mariah, did you have anything you wanted to say?
Thank you everyone for your time and sharing, and please stay with us on this journey. We hope to be here for the year, every month.
Absolutely. So enjoy the rest of your day, and we again look forward to seeing you. We have all the topics up on the website for the next 12 sessions. If you have any ideas about speakers that you think we should, people we should speak with for different topics, please do let us know. We are on this journey together to try and really just increase the amount of dialogue we're having in this country, because we really firmly believe that every dialogue we have is like throwing a pebble in a pond. Those rippling effects are going to accumulate and just help create a better environment for everyone. So enjoy the rest of your day, and we will see you next month.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. And thank you
Thanks,
everyone for
Sangeeta.
joining.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.